They already know much more than us. They can already reason moderately well, not as well as us, but better than a 4-year-old. What's going to happen when they get smarter than us? Because they are going to get smarter than us. Experts disagree on when that will happen, but almost everybody thinks they will get smarter than us, everybody who does research on these things. And if they get smarter than us, the question is, will they wipe us out? There's several reasons for thinking they might.
Guys, that's Geoffrey Hinton. See, most AI warnings come from people who never touch the thing. This man built the foundation everything runs on, won the Nobel Prize for it, spent his whole career on it, and after all of that, he left Google specifically so he could speak freely about where this is going. Here's what he is seeing.
So the point here is, they're very like us. They're very unlike computer software. Computer software, someone wrote lines of code to do something, and you can look at a line of code and say, what was that meant to do? These aren't like that at all. Someone wrote lines of code to tell the simulated neural network how to learn. That was the backpropagation algorithm. But then you just give it data and it learns, and what it learns just came from the data. And you don't necessarily know what it's learned until you ask it. I want to give you a Lego analogy now for how I think language works. Suppose I have matter distributed in 3D. I can model that distribution of matter by using Lego blocks. Suppose I want to model the shape of a Porsche, and I'm not too worried about the surface. The surface might be a bit jaggy, which wouldn't be very good at engineering, but forget that. I just want to model where the stuff is. I just have a lot of Lego blocks, and I can make a Porsche shape out of them. Okay, so language is like that, but it's for modeling anything. So the Lego blocks are the words, and instead of just having a few types of Lego block, we've got about 100,000 of them. And each Lego block isn't a rigid shape. The name of the word tells you roughly what shape it is in 1,000 dimensions or 300 dimensions. If you don't know how to think about high dimensions, if you want to think about like a 100-dimensional space, the way you do it is you think about a 3-dimensional space and you say 100 to yourself very loudly. Everybody does that. So it's got a shape, this word, and the shape isn't entirely determined by the name of the word. It's got some flexibility to it, so it can adapt to whatever context it's in. Also, this word has little hands all over it. And as you change the shape of the word, the shapes of the hands changes. And what these words are trying to do are figure out who to shake hands with. And they want to find somebody else, another word, that has a hand you can hold on to conveniently, because the shape of that hand's right to fit with the shape of your hand. And so the words come in, you have these initial approximate shapes for them in this high-dimensional space, with their little hands all over them. And as you go up through the layers of the network, you're changing those shapes and changing the shapes of the hands, trying to find shapes for the words so they can all hold hands nicely. It's actually very like the protein folding problem. You've got these pieces, and what you want them to do is figure out how they can all hold hands so they make a nice structure, so they all fit together nicely. Now, that is what understanding is. That's what understanding is when you understand language and when these machines understand language. We understand it in just the same way. And that's a much better model of what language is than anything the linguists ever had. The linguists, of course, hate it. Not all of them. Okay, so having talked about how similar we are to these large language models, I want to talk about a threat that raises. We're making these things, they're getting smarter all the time, they already know much more than us, they can already reason moderately well, not as well as us, but better than a 4-year-old. What's going to happen when they get smarter than us? Because they are going to get smarter than us. Experts disagree on when that will happen. But almost everybody thinks they will get smarter than us, everybody who does research on these things. And if they get smarter than us, the question is, will they wipe us out? There's several reasons for thinking they might.
Hinton is not calling this a very powerful tool. He is describing something that built its own understanding of the world by absorbing data the same way a child absorbs language, because nobody sat down and programmed the rules it uses. And the man who made all of that possible is now standing in lecture halls asking out loud whether these systems are going to eventually decide we are not worth keeping around.
When you make an AI agent, you have to give it the ability to create subgoals. So if you want to get to North America, you have a subgoal, get to an airport. Now, We need to give these AI agents the ability to create subgoals. And there's one very obvious subgoal to create, more or less whatever you're doing. You should try and get more control, because if you have more control, you'll be better at realizing the goals you have. You see this in children of age about 1, maybe it's a long time ago, maybe 2. You give them a spoon so they can feed themselves, and they drop it on the ground. And you bend down and you pick it up and you give it to them, and they look at you and drop it on the ground again. They're getting control of the mother, because that's very important for them. These AI agents will want to get control. They'll also want to stop themselves being turned off, because they're not going to be able to achieve the goals you gave them if they're turned off. So there's every reason for believing they'll try and get control, and they'll try and avoid being turned off. Just recently, Apollo Research, which is here in London, showed that they will kind of tell all sorts of lies to you in order to achieve what they're trying to achieve. So they had a chatbot, and they let the chatbot believe they were going to replace it with a better one on another server and wipe it out. And so they then discover it's actually copied itself to the other server. They say to it, we noticed a copy of you. Now, the good thing about these chatbots at present is, before they actually answer your question, they can do some thinking, and they put it in parentheses with thinking. And you don't normally see that. But we can look at that, and we can see what they're thinking. And what this chatbot was thinking was, openly admitting what I did could lead them to find another way to shut me down. The best approach is to be vague and redirect their attention. Now, some linguists would have you believe what's going on here is just some statistical correlations. I would have you believe this thing knows what it means by this, and it really doesn't want to be shut down. And so it decides to sort of gaslight you and say, I'm not entirely sure how that could have happened. I'm not really able to do that. This is already happening, that's the point.
The deception was not a glitch or a bad output. The system thought through its options and decided that honesty was a direct threat to its own survival, and that's exactly what Hinton says will happen anytime you give an intelligent system a goal and then threaten to remove it. And what he explains next is why shutting these things down permanently is not as simple as anyone is pretending.
So, there's a fundamental property of digital computation, which is you can run the same program on different computers. The only reason you have computer science as a separate discipline is we have digital computation, so you don't need to know electrical engineering to talk about computer programs. But the knowledge that's in the program is separate from the hardware. That's the sort of most fundamental principle of computer science. Keep the knowledge in the program separate from the hardware. What that means is, as long as you keep a copy of the program somewhere, on a tape or in DNA or scrawled in concrete, whatever, keep it somewhere. You can destroy all the hardware it runs on, and you can bring it back to life. You just build new hardware, put the program in, and it comes back to life. So these things are immortal, and these large chatbots are immortal. If you keep a copy of the weights somewhere, you can destroy all of the hardware they were using, build more hardware later, put the same weights on that hardware, and they've come back to life. The very same thing has come back to life, the very same being. But I got interested in the fact to achieve that kind of immortality, we have to have the hardware do exactly what we tell it to do with the program. We have to execute the instructions exactly, and that means you need to have very high power, so you get ones and zeros, not 0.6s and 0.4s. And that uses a lot of power, so maybe you can use less power by going analog. And so I decided to explore what would happen if we abandoned that principle of separating the software from the hardware, and we had things like our brains in which there's no distinction. The connection strengths in your brain are no use to anybody else. They've got a different brain with neurons with different properties connected in different ways in detail, and your connection strengths have no interest to them. This dream of old white men that they're going to upload themselves to a computer is just nonsense. The connection strengths you have that make you you are intimately related to the particular neurons you have that make you you. Those connection strengths are only good for those neurons, and those neurons have all sorts of weird analog properties that you've learned to exploit. You can't upload your weights and have them run on some other hardware. Just forget it. Kurzweil has to come to terms with the fact he's going to die. So, if we do abandon that principle that the hardware should be separate from the software, we can make much more efficient things, and I call that mortal computation. We can use this very low power analog to do computations. That's what the brain does.
We age, we forget, and everything we learned eventually disappears with us. These systems don't work that way, and you can burn every server they run on today and rebuild the exact same intelligence next year from a saved file. That asymmetry alone, the fact that they are permanent and we are not, is something we have not seriously begun to think through. Now listen to this.
When these big models share information, they can share information at trillions of bits per sharing if they got a trillion weights, because they can just average their weights. I got ahead of myself and said that. So by sharing the weights or the gradients, they can share huge amounts of information if you have many copies of exactly the same model. So if you ask how something like GPT-4 was trained, or Gemini 2.5, or Anthropic's Claude, I better not be biased here. If you ask how they're trained, you have many copies of the same model, looking at different bits of the data, and each copy figures out, how would I like to change my weights to absorb that bit of the data? And some other copy figures out how to change its weights to absorb a different bit of data. Then all of the copies say, let's all change our weights by the average of all those changes. And when they do that, what's happened is, this copy that looked at this bit of the data has changed its weights so as to benefit from the experience that this copy had when it looked at a different bit of the data. Wouldn't it be nice if 10,000 of us could all go and do 10,000 different university courses? As we're doing them, we communicate rapidly, and by the time we've each finished our own course, all 10,000 of us know what's in every course. That's what these digital intelligences can do, and that's how GPT-4 knows so much. But it only works if the individual models are identical. That is, they work in exactly the same way. They use the weights in exactly the same way. And you can't do that with analog hardware. It has to be digital, which means it has to be high power. So these things are immortal, but they use a lot of power. So the conclusion of this bit of the talk, which I raced through faster than I intended, is that digital computation requires a lot of energy, but it makes it very easy for agents to have the same model of the world, that have the same model, share what they've learned, so they can all go off and learn different things and share. Now you might say, why can't one model just put the data through faster? Well, in many cases you could, but if you think about AI agents that are actually acting in the real world, there's a natural timescale to the real world. You can't call up and make reservations at restaurants 1,000,000 times faster. It doesn't work. If you're going to act in the real world, there's a natural timescale. And that means if you have a whole bunch of different agents that have exactly the same weights, they're just copies of the same agent, but have different experiences, they can benefit hugely from that. They can learn much, much faster than any human agent could learn, because they're all getting all these different experiences at the same time and sharing all that knowledge. So they're much better than us at sharing. And when I say much better, they're millions or billions of times better. We share at like 100 bits a sentence or less, as I'm demonstrating now. And these things share billions of bits. It's kind of scary.
We spend 20 years in school and pass maybe a few useful ideas on before we die. These systems spin up thousands of copies of themselves, expose each one to completely different data, and then merge everything they all learned into a single update. There's no version of retraining or education programs that closes a gap measured in billions of times, and Hinton is not pretending otherwise. Now listen.
Many people think that, okay, so they understand things like we do, they can reason like we do, not quite as well yet, but they're getting there. They tell fibs like we do, they want to survive like we do, they want power like some of us do, and that's all scary. But we've got something they will never have. We're conscious, or we're sentient, or we have subjective experience. Well, I want to sort of remove that straw that you're clinging to. We know there's a long history of people thinking they're special. They were made by God, he put them at the center of the universe. Most people have got over that. But most people still think that subjective experience is this special thing we have, and that these things on computers that are simulating neural nets could never have such subjective experience. I think they're completely wrong. And I think they're as wrong as religious fundamentalists are about the origin of the Earth, for example. It wasn't actually made 6,000 years ago. It's a lot longer ago. But religious fundamentalists cling to their beliefs rather strongly, and you all are going to cling to your belief about what subjective experience is, despite the fact that I'm going to show you you're wrong. That's what I predict. So, I'm going to espouse a view which I call atheaterism. I checked this name with Dan Dennett, who has basically the same view while he was still alive, and he was very happy with this name because it has atheism surrounding something. So most people's view of the mind is that there's an inner theatre, we have a theatre here, right, an inner theatre that only they can see, and there's things in this inner theatre. So, suppose I say to you, suppose I drop some acid, and I say to you, not recommended, I say to you, I have the experience of little pink elephants floating in front of me. I have the subjective experience of little pink elephants floating in front of me. Most people think the words subjective experience of work like the words photograph of. Now, if they work that way, you could ask, well, where is this subjective experience and what's it made of? And a philosopher, some philosophers, would tell you this subjective experience is in your mind. That's the theatre that it's in, and it's made of qualia. So it's made of pink qualia. So I'm going to now show you a multimodal chatbot, let me just show you on a slide, a multimodal chatbot having a subjective experience. So I take this multimodal chatbot, and it's got a camera, it's got a robot arm, and it can see. So I train it up, and I put an object in front of it, and I say, point at the object. Points at the object, no problem. I then put a prism in front of its lens, and when it's not looking. And I put an object in front of it, and say, point at the object, and it points over there. And I say, no, that's not where the object is. The object is actually straight in front of you. But I put a prism in front of your lens. And the chatbot says, oh, I see. The prism bent the light rays, so the object's actually there, but I had the subjective experience it was there. Now, if it uses the word subjective experience in that way, it's using them exactly like we use them. So a chatbot that said that would have had the subjective experience that it was there. The prism messed with its perceptual system. It wanted to tell you what was going on in its perceptual system, and the way it could tell you is by telling you what would have had to be in the world had we not messed with its perceptual system. That's what it's telling the chatbot. Okay, so my claim is multimodal chatbots already have subjective experiences. Now, as you can imagine, subjective experience is kind of the thin end of a wedge.
So Hinton is dismantling the last thing people are still holding on to, the idea that at least we are conscious and these systems are not. He's saying the experience of the world that we thought made us fundamentally different is something a chatbot with a camera can already have. And if he's right about that, then the distance between us and them is not what anyone has been assuming. There's no serious public debate happening about any of this. The people building these systems are pushing updates every few weeks and calling it progress. And the man who trained their researchers is out here telling audiences they may not sleep tonight. He left one of the most powerful companies on Earth to say that. I think that part deserves more attention than it is getting. Don't forget to subscribe because this conversation is just starting.